June 4th, 1942, 6:03 in the morning, somewhere northwest of Midway Atoll, above a gray Pacific broken by whitecaps and low cloud. An American patrol plane droned through the dawn. The ocean beneath looked endless, empty, and indifferent. To the men inside the PBY Catalina, the world was reduced to engine vibration, salt-streaked glass, and the hard glare of early sun on water. They had been sent out to find a fleet that might decide the future of the Pacific War. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force was moving through the sea with 4 of the finest aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. For weeks, American codebreakers had warned that Japan was coming for Midway. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had believed them. Now Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, waited northeast of the island with USS Enterprise and USS Hornet. Nearby, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher held overall tactical command from USS Yorktown, but all the careful planning, all the intelligence work, all the courage in the world still depended on one thing. Someone had to find the Japanese carriers first. Inside Enterprise, Spruance was not pacing. That was not his way. He stood in the flag plot with a stillness that made younger officers uneasy. He was a cruiser admiral, suddenly commanding carriers because Admiral William Halsey had been hospitalized with illness. Spruance had not spent his career as an aviator. He did not speak with dramatic gestures. He was thin, composed, almost severe, a man whose calm could feel colder than fear. Around him, radios crackled, men leaned over charts, grease pencils marked courses, bearings, estimated speeds. Every report mattered. Every minute mattered more. Then the first sighting came in from Midway search aircraft. Enemy carriers bearing 320, distance 180 miles. The words moved through the American ships like an electric current. No one cheered. Not yet. The information was incomplete, but it was enough to tighten every jaw in the task force. The Japanese striking force had been found on the flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet. Crews were already moving with practiced violence. Plane handlers dragged aircraft into position. Fuel hoses came away. Bombs hung under dauntless dive bombers. Torpedoes waited beneath devastators. Wildcats sat with engines coughing and propellers flashing into silver discs. The flight deck smelled of gasoline, hot oil, canvas, and sweat. Spruance had a decision to make. The Japanese carriers were still far away. Too far, according to some calculations, for a comfortable strike. If he launched immediately, his pilots might reach the enemy at the edge of their fuel limits. They might have trouble finding the carriers. They might be forced to ditch in the sea. If he waited, the range would close. The strike would be better coordinated, and the squadrons might attack together. But waiting carried its own danger. Nagumo's aircraft had already struck Midway. His planes would soon be returning to their carriers. Decks would be crowded. Bombs, torpedoes, fuel lines, and aircraft would be exposed. There might be a brief moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. A moment measured not in hours, but in minutes. Spruance understood the brutal arithmetic of carrier warfare. The side that struck first could cripple the enemy before the enemy even knew where to aim. The side that hesitated might find its own flight decks burning. Captain Miles Browning, Halsey's aggressive chief of staff, pressed for an immediate launch. Others worried about range and coordination. Spruance listened. He did not need noise to show authority. His mind worked through distance, timing, fuel, wind, and probability. Then he made the decision. The order was simple, cold, direct. Launch the attack across Enterprise. The signal became action. Engines roared harder. Deck crews crouched low. Flags snapped in the wind. The first aircraft rolled forward. its wheels bouncing over the wooden deck as the carrier turned into the breeze. One by one, American planes lifted off into the morning, climbing toward a battle they could not yet see. Spruance watched the strike go out, knowing exactly what he had done. He had chosen speed over perfection. He had chosen risk over hesitation. He had sent his airmen toward the Japanese carriers before the enemy could turn the same weapon against him. Far to the west, Nagumo still did not know that the trap was closing. June 4th, 1942, 7 o'clock in the morning. Aboard USS Enterprise. The Pacific wind came hard across the bow as the carrier drove into launch position. The ship seemed to tremble under the pressure of its own machinery. Deep below the flight deck, boilers fed steam into turbines. Above, men worked in a dangerous rhythm around spinning propellers and armed aircraft. Every movement had a purpose. Every mistake could kill. Dive bombers from Enterprise lined up with bombs beneath their bellies. Torpedo planes weighted heavily, their long weapons slung low and awkward. Fighters stood ready to climb as escorts, though every pilot knew the distance to the target might stretch fuel and nerves alike. The deck crews wore colored jerseys that flashed through the haze like pieces of a code known only to the carrier world. Yellow shirts directed aircraft. Blue shirts handled planes. Red shirts armed bombs and torpedoes. Purple shirts fed aviation gasoline into machines that would soon fly toward fire. Spruance remained focused on the larger pattern beyond the deck. The Japanese had 4 carriers. He had 2 in Task Force 16 Enterprise and Hornet, with Yorktown operating under Fletcher nearby. The American force could not afford to absorb the first major carrier blow. It had to deliver one. The report from the search plane had placed the enemy to the southwest, but reports at sea could be wrong. Bearings could be imprecise. A moving carrier force could cover miles while messages passed through airwaves and decoding rooms. Clouds could hide ships. Pilots could miss by a few degrees and find nothing but water until their fuel gauges fell toward empty. That was the nightmare of carrier warfare. The enemy might be only a few miles beyond sight, yet unreachable if the search pattern failed. A commander did not simply order a strike. He gambled with distance, fuel, weather, enemy movement, and the lives of men who might never see land again. Captain Miles Browning believed the answer was speed. Strike now. Hit before Nagumo recovered from the Midway attack. Hit while Japanese decks were confused, while aircraft were being refueled and rearmed, while decisions on the enemy flagship were still unfolding. Spruance did not share Browning's temperament, but he saw the logic. His own caution was not timidity. It was discipline. He had spent years in cruisers and destroyers, learning that a commander who acted too early could be ruined by his own impatience. But Midway was not a gunnery duel where ships closed to visible range. It was a contest of minutes over hundreds of miles. He asked for calculations. He listened to the estimates. He studied the time. He knew that the Japanese carriers had launched against Midway before dawn. Their aircraft would return. Their flight decks would have to land them, service them, spot new strikes, and prepare for whatever came next. If Nagumo discovered the American carriers before Spruance's planes arrived, the entire American force might be caught under a coordinated attack. On Enterprise, the launch continued. The first fighters clawed upward. Then came the torpedo planes, slower and heavier, their crews sealed inside metal frames that many of them knew were outdated. The TBD Devastator had once been admired, but by 1942 it was too slow against modern fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Its crews understood this without needing anyone to say it aloud. They strapped in anyway. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers followed, their pilots and rear gunners surrounded by the smell of oil, leather, metal, and salt. The Dauntless was rugged, but it demanded nerve. Its attack would require diving almost vertically through flak, holding steady long enough to aim, then pulling out with the ocean and enemy ships rushing upward. The men leaving Enterprise did not yet know that their courses and timing would scatter them. They did not know that some would search empty sea. They did not know that the battle would soon become a series of separate struggles, each squadron fighting alone, each crew wondering whether anyone else was still with them. Spruance could not know those details either. What he knew was that delay might be fatal. Hornet also began launching. Her air group rose from the deck and turned toward the believed position of the Japanese fleet. Enterprise sent her own squadrons forward. The sky filled with aircraft, then slowly emptied as they disappeared into distance and haze. In the flag plot, the atmosphere did not relax after the launch. It tightened. Once the aircraft were gone, Spruance had no hand on them. They were beyond direct control, moving through uncertain sky toward a fleet that might change course at any moment. There was another danger. By launching so much of his striking power, Spruance had left his carriers exposed. If Japanese scouts found him and Nagumo launched first, Enterprise and Hornet would have fewer aircraft available for immediate defense. Combat air patrol fighters remained overhead, but no carrier commander could feel safe once his strike group was gone. Yet Spruance did not call them back. He did not dilute the order. He did not wait for perfect confirmation. The decision had been made because he understood something essential. In carrier battle, certainty often arrived too late to be useful. By 7:45, the American strike aircraft were spread across the sky, searching toward the west and southwest. Below them, the sea remained blank and immense. Pilots checked headings. Radio men listened. Gunners scanned for fighters. Fuel burned away minute by minute. Far ahead, Nagumo's carriers were recovering aircraft from the Midway strike. Reports of American ships had begun to disturb the Japanese command. Torpedoes and bombs were being shifted. Aircraft were being prepared, then reconsidered, then prepared again. Hangar decks grew crowded with machines, weapons, hoses, and crews. The moment Spruance had gambled on was forming, but the American airmen still had to find it. June 4th, 1942, 8:10 in the morning. The American strike groups were now far from their carriers, moving across an ocean that seemed determined to hide the enemy. From the cockpit of an SBD Dauntless, the Pacific was a sheet of blue-gray light, broken only by cloud shadows and thin white lines of wind. The aircraft vibrated constantly. The engine noise filled every thought. Behind the pilot, the rear gunner twisted in his seat, scanning the sky through clear panels and metal framing, looking for the first dark specks of Japanese fighters. The men had been launched toward coordinates, not certainty. They watched compasses. They checked fuel. They searched for smoke on the horizon, wakes on the sea, the shape of ships where no ships should be. Every minute made the problem worse. The Japanese fleet was moving. The American planes were moving. The wind was pushing against them. The original sighting report was aging like milk in the sun. Some aircraft from Hornet followed a course that led them toward empty water. The pilots pressed on, trusting the heading, trusting command, trusting that the enemy would appear. But the ocean gave them nothing. No carriers, no destroyers, no anti-aircraft bursts, no target worth the fuel they were spending. This was the hidden cruelty of carrier warfare. Men could fly into combat and die without ever seeing the battle. They could be brave, disciplined, and doomed by a few degrees of bearing. Enterprise aircraft faced their own confusion. But Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, refused to give up the search. A former fighter pilot now commanding a bomber group, McCluskey understood that the fuel situation was becoming dangerous. His men were deep into enemy waters. Turning back too soon might spare aircraft, but lose the battle. Continuing too long might mean ditching into the Pacific, even if they survived the attack. Below them, the sea remained empty. Then, far beneath, McCluskey saw something small and urgent cutting through the water. A Japanese destroyer. It was Arashi, racing northward after attacking an American submarine. The destroyer was moving at high speed, throwing a white wake behind it like an arrow drawn across the sea. McCluskey understood instantly what that wake might mean. A destroyer traveling alone at such speed was likely returning to the main force. He turned his bombers to follow it. That choice, like Spruance's earlier order, carried the weight of timing and instinct. No one on Enterprise could guide him now. No admiral could whisper the answer into his headset. McCluskey had only his judgment, his fuel gauges, and the narrow white scar of Arashi's wake pointing across the water. While the dive bombers searched, the torpedo squadrons were finding the Japanese carriers in the worst possible way. Torpedo Squadron 8, from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, had broken away from the rest of Hornet's air group after disagreement over the enemy's position. Waldron believed the Japanese carriers lay on a different bearing. He chose his own course. His 15 TBD Devastators flew low, slow, and exposed over the Pacific. Soon they saw ships. The Japanese carrier force appeared ahead like a dark, moving city on the sea. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers cut through the water in formation. Above them circled the deadly shield of Mitsubishi, A-6 M0 fighters. Waldron did not turn away. His torpedo planes descended toward attack altitude. At that height, there was almost no room for escape. To launch their torpedoes, the Devastators had to fly straight, slow, and low toward some of the most heavily defended ships in the world. The Japanese fighters came down on them almost at once. Machine gun and cannon fire ripped through the formation. Devastators shuddered, burned, and fell. Some struck the water in sheets of spray. Others trailed smoke before vanishing beneath the waves. Rear gunners fired back desperately. But the Zeros were faster, lighter, and merciless. Waldron pressed ahead until he too was shot down. One by one, Torpedo 8 disappeared. Ensign George Gay, flying one of the Devastators, saw his squadron destroyed around him. His plane was hit. His radio man gunner was killed. Gay went into the water and later hid beneath a seat cushion as the battle passed around him. From the surface of the Pacific, he would become a witness to history, floating among oil, wreckage, and the ghosts of his squadron. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked as well. They too came in low against fighters and flak. Their courage was absolute, but their aircraft and weapons betrayed them. Torpedoes missed, failed, or never had a chance to run. Planes were cut apart before they could release. Then Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 arrived and suffered the same terrible punishment. To the Japanese lookouts, it seemed as if the American attacks were brave but clumsy, arriving in pieces, never properly coordinated. The torpedo planes had not landed a fatal blow. They had not crippled a carrier. They had not even forced a torpedo hit. But they had done something else. They pulled the Japanese combat air patrol downward. Zeros dived to sea level to destroy the torpedo planes. Japanese ships twisted and turned to evade attacks. Their formations strained. Their flight decks were still crowded with aircraft being recovered, refueled, rearmed, and repositioned. The sky above the carriers began to open. High overhead, McCluskey's dauntless dive bombers were approaching. The crews did not yet see the full Japanese fleet. They saw glints, wakes, and distant shapes. Then the carriers emerged from the haze below. For a moment, the men in the SBDs looked down on the answer to every search, every risk, every anxious calculation made aboard Enterprise. There they were. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Japanese carriers, exposed beneath them. June 4th, 1942. 10:20 in the morning. High above the Japanese carrier force, American dive bombers began to roll over into their attacks. For the pilots and rear gunners of Enterprise and Yorktown, the scene below was almost too large to absorb. The Japanese fleet filled the sea with motion. Destroyers threw white curves across the water. Cruisers and battleships fired upward. Carriers turned hard beneath them, their wakes bending like pale scars on the Pacific. Then the first black puffs of anti-aircraft fire bloomed in the sky. The SBD dauntless crews pushed forward anyway. Inside the cockpits, pilots leaned toward their sights, their hands tightened on controls. Dive brakes opened with a shudder, slowing the aircraft as they tipped toward near vertical descent. The ocean rushed upward. The carriers grew from gray shapes into long flight decks marked by red circles. Aircraft, elevators, and frantic crews. Below, the Japanese were not ready for this. Their fighters had been drawn low by the torpedo attacks. Many Zeros were near sea level, chasing the last American torpedo planes or climbing too slowly to intercept. The dive bombers had arrived from above at the moment when Nagumo's carriers were most vulnerable. The hangar decks were crowded. Aircraft were armed. Fuel hoses had been used again and again through the morning. Bombs and torpedoes had been shifted as Nagumo tried to decide whether to prepare another attack on Midway or strike the newly reported American ships. The Japanese carriers were powerful, disciplined war machines. But for a few minutes, their own complexity became a trap. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's group divided over the targets. Confusion struck even at the edge of triumph. Too many Enterprise bombers initially aimed for Kaga, leaving Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, with fewer attackers. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, recognized the danger and turned toward Akagi with only a small number of planes. It was a decision made in seconds, and it changed the battle. The first Dauntlesses screamed down on Kaga. Japanese gunners fired desperately. Shell bursts rocked the air. Tracers climbed in red and white streams. But the American pilots held their dives. One after another, bombs fell. Kaga was struck brutally. Explosions ripped through her flight deck. Bombs punched into spaces filled with fueled and armed aircraft. Fire spread with terrifying speed. Men were thrown across the deck. Aircraft ignited. Smoke rose in thick columns. A carrier that had helped strike Pearl Harbor now burned under the same sky it had expected to dominate. At nearly the same time, Yorktown's dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie attacked Soryu. Leslie's bombers had suffered problems before the attack. Some had lost their bombs due to electrical arming failures and had to dive without them, while others still carried weapons. Yet enough bombs struck home. Soryu erupted in flame. Her flight deck was smashed. Fires spread below. The carrier's ability to operate aircraft vanished in minutes. Then came Akagi. Richard Best and his few accompanying aircraft dived on the Japanese flagship. Akagi was not hit by a storm of bombs. She did not need to be. One bomb, placed with terrible precision, struck near the midship elevator and exploded among armed aircraft and ordnance. Another near miss hurled water and force against the hull. The result was catastrophic. Flame raced through Akagi's hangar. Torpedoes and bombs waited inside like stored thunder. Aviation fuel fed the fire. Damage control teams fought through smoke and heat. But the ship had become a furnace. Vice Admiral Nagumo, who had launched the attack on Midway and commanded the carrier force that had once seemed unstoppable, now faced disaster aboard his own flagship. Communications faltered. Smoke filled compartments. The center of Japanese naval power in the Pacific was burning beneath him. From above, the American dive bomber crews saw explosions blossom across the enemy carriers. They saw columns of smoke rising from ships that had been almost untouched minutes before. The attack had lasted only a handful of minutes, but those minutes tore open the balance of the Pacific War. At sea level, surviving torpedo crews had paid for that opening with blood. The devastators had drawn fighters down and forced evasive maneuvers. Their sacrifice had not been planned as a neat step in a perfect battle diagram. It had been chaos, courage, and loss. But now, as the dive bombers pulled out over burning carriers, the terrible connection became clear. The men who went in low had helped make room for the men who came from above. The American SBDs climbed away through flak and smoke. Some were damaged, some were low on fuel. Their crews had little time to admire the destruction. Enemy fighters still prowled. The long flight back to their carriers remained ahead, and for some, the ocean would be the only landing field. Aboard Enterprise, Spruance waited for news. He had launched early, before certainty hardened into safety. Now fragments of reports began to arrive. Enemy carriers hit, fires observed, smoke rising. Details were confused, but the meaning was unmistakable. Something immense had happened. Spruance did not celebrate wildly. That was not his nature. He absorbed the information with the same controlled intensity that had marked his decision to launch. The enemy had been struck first, not perfectly, not neatly, but decisively. Yet the battle was not over. One Japanese carrier remained operational. Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, had escaped the morning destruction. Her flight deck was intact. Her air group was still capable of striking back. While Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, Hiryu turned into the wind and began launching aircraft. The Japanese counterblow was coming. June 4th, 1942. Late morning. The smoke from Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu climbed into the Pacific sky. But one Japanese flight deck still answered orders. Hiryu was alive. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi understood what had happened around him. 3 carriers had been smashed in minutes. The proud striking force that had crossed the Pacific with such confidence was now broken, but not helpless. Hiryu still had aircraft. Hiryu still had pilots. Hiryu still had a commander willing to attack even while disaster closed from every side. On her flight deck, Japanese crews worked with frantic discipline. Aircraft were spotted forward. Engines coughed alive. Pilots climbed into cockpits knowing that their fleet had been wounded almost beyond recognition. The mood was not panic. It was something harder, something colder. A counter-strike was the only answer left. Soon, Japanese dive bombers lifted from Hiryu and turned toward the American carriers. Their target would be found. USS Yorktown had already survived months of war that should have kept her away from Midway. Damaged at the Coral Sea, repaired at Pearl Harbor in a furious rush. She had returned to battle with welders barely finished and work crews still fresh in memory. Now she steamed under Fletcher's flag, patched, scarred, but still dangerous. When Hiryu's dive bombers approached, Yorktown's radar and lookouts gave warning. Fighters climbed to intercept. Anti-aircraft crews moved to their guns. The carrier turned hard, engines pushing her through the sea as men braced for the attack. Japanese aircraft came through. The first bombs fell around Yorktown in great white columns. Then hits landed. Explosions tore into the ship. Smoke and flame rose from her flight deck. Boilers were knocked out. Yorktown slowed and lost power. For a time she seemed mortally wounded, but American damage control teams fought with astonishing speed. Sailors dragged hoses through smoke. Engineers restored power. Repair parties patched flight deck damage. Fires were contained. The ship that should have been finished began to move again. From a distance, Japanese pilots saw Yorktown damaged and smoking. When they returned to Hiryu, they reported that they had struck an American carrier. To Japanese command, it appeared likely that one carrier had been disabled. Then Hiryu launched again. This second strike carried torpedo planes. They came hunting for what they believed might be another American carrier. But the sea gave them Yorktown once more, because American repair crews had restored speed and flight operations. She looked like a fresh target rather than the same battered ship hit earlier. The Japanese attacked with skill and courage. Torpedo planes came in low over the water while American fighters and gunners tried to break them apart. Yorktown twisted to evade, but torpedoes found her. Explosions slammed into her side. The carrier lurched. Water rushed in. Her list grew dangerous. This time, the damage was too severe. Men moved across slanting decks. Equipment slid loose. Orders passed through smoke and confusion. The ship that had refused to die now leaned heavily into the sea. Fletcher eventually transferred his flag. Yorktown's crew prepared to abandon her, though the carrier would remain afloat long enough for later salvage efforts to begin. For Spruance, the danger was now brutally clear. The Japanese had hit back. One surviving enemy carrier had already crippled Yorktown. If Hiryu remained operational into the afternoon, she could strike Enterprise or Hornet next. There was no room for hesitation. American scout aircraft searched again through the afternoon. Reports began to form around the surviving Japanese carrier. Hiryu had to be found, fixed, and destroyed before she could launch another attack. Aboard Enterprise, the flight deck once again became a place of urgency. Aircraft returned damaged, low on fuel, and sometimes without the men who had flown out beside them. Others were prepared for another strike. Mechanics worked on engines with burned hands and oil-streaked faces. Armorers handled bombs as if time itself were a weapon. Spruance knew that the earlier victory would mean less if the remaining Japanese carrier survived to continue the fight. He also knew that his own carriers were now precious beyond measure. The United States had entered the battle with too few fleet carriers to waste. Enterprise and Hornet had to be protected. Yet protection could not mean passivity. This was the cruel balance of command. A cautious man might save his ships for a few hours and lose the battle by allowing Hiryu to attack again. A reckless man might spend his aircraft blindly and leave the force defenseless. Spruance chose the middle path that had defined him. All morning, act firmly, act quickly, but act with purpose. The afternoon strike went out. Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, including aircraft from Yorktown that had landed aboard after their own carrier was damaged, flew toward the reported position of Hiryu. The sun was lower now. The light across the Pacific had changed. Men who had already survived one strike climbed again into danger because the battle demanded it. They found Hiryu. The Japanese carrier maneuvered below, her crew still fighting to preserve striking power, still surrounded by escorts, still dangerous. But the American dive bombers had the altitude, the training, and the opportunity. They rolled over and attacked. Bombs struck Hiryu. Fires erupted across her flight deck and hangar spaces. Aircraft burned. Explosions spread below. The last operational carrier of Nagumo's morning force was transformed into a burning wreck. For Yamaguchi, the end came with grim dignity. He chose to remain with his ship. Hiryu would not launch again. As evening approached, the Pacific was marked by pillars of smoke from 4 Japanese carriers. The ships that had seemed to hold the initiative at dawn were now ruined. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the heart of Japan's carrier-striking force, had been lost or doomed in a single day. Aboard Enterprise, the reports reached Spruance in pieces. Hiryu hit, Hiryu burning. No enemy carriers left operational. There was no theatrical speech, no grand performance for history. Spruance's strength was not in dramatic words, it was in judgment. When Japanese carriers were finally located, the essence of what he said had been contained in that first decisive order. Launch the attack. Those words had sent men into uncertainty before the situation was clean, before the enemy was fully understood, before safety could be guaranteed. They had carried the logic of the entire battle. Find the enemy. Strike first. Do not surrender the clock. Yet as darkness approached, Spruance faced one more decision. The Americans had won a stunning blow, but Japanese surface ships still existed beyond the horizon. Night was coming, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was deadly in night fighting. Spruance had cruisers and destroyers, but his most valuable weapons were carriers, and carriers were vulnerable in darkness against surface attack. He had to decide whether to chase or withdraw. Again, Victory tempted risk. Again, Spruance chose survival with discipline. June 4th, 1942. Evening. The light over the Pacific faded into copper, then purple, then the deep blue of coming night. Spruance stood with the knowledge that few commanders ever receive in the middle of battle. He had struck the enemy's heart. 4 Japanese carriers had been found, attacked, and left burning. The very ships that had carried Japanese power across the ocean since Pearl Harbor were now wrecks. Their flight decks twisted, their hangars filled with flame, their crews fighting impossible fires. Yet the sea was still dangerous. Victory did not make the night safe. Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers remained somewhere beyond the darkening horizon. Their commanders knew how to fight in darkness. Their lookouts were trained for it. Their torpedoes could reach with terrifying range and force. If Spruance drove west too aggressively, he might bring Enterprise and Hornet into the kind of night surface battle the Japanese wanted. A carrier was a weapon of distance. It killed by sending aircraft across miles of sky. In darkness, with aircraft grounded and visibility collapsing, that advantage could disappear. Then the carrier became a large, fragile target, its flight deck useless, its hangars full of fuel and aircraft, its survival dependent on escorts and luck. Spruance understood this. He had not won the day by confusing boldness with recklessness. He had launched early because the timing demanded it. Now he refused to chase blindly because the timing had changed. The same mind that had accepted risk in the morning now rejected needless exposure at night. So he turned east. To some, it might have looked like withdrawal at the moment of triumph. To Spruance, it was preservation of the victory already gained. He would not hand Japan a chance to undo the day's disaster in a night torpedo attack. He would protect the carriers, keep them ready for dawn, and force the Japanese to face the morning without the carrier strength they had possessed at sunrise. Aboard Enterprise, the mood was not simple celebration. Men were exhausted, pilots were missing, squadrons had been shattered, torpedo crews had gone out and not come back. The flight deck had received aircraft low on fuel, damaged by flak, and sometimes barely under control. The price of victory could be read in empty bunks, silent ready rooms, and the names that did not answer, roll call. For the men who had survived, the day felt unreal. They had seen Japanese carriers burn. They had watched enemy ships vanish beneath smoke. They had returned to decks where crews grabbed their wings, folded them, refueled them, and pushed them aside for the next launch. There had been no clean line between terror and routine. War had moved through them like machinery. Spruance did not need to raise his voice over that machinery. His command style remained restrained, almost invisible. He did not seek applause. He did not dress the moment in heroic language. But the decision he had made when the Japanese carriers were finally located had already spoken for him. Launch the attack. Those words were not a slogan. They were not a flourish for reporters. They were a command given under pressure, with incomplete information, against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable for 6 months. In those words was the core of carrier warfare. Reconnaissance creates the chance. Timing decides its value, and command must act before certainty becomes history. At Midway, reconnaissance had found Nagumo's carriers. Timing had exposed them at the worst possible moment. Spruance had recognized the opening and refused to let it close. That is why the phrase matters. It was not long. It was not poetic. It did not need to be. The Pacific War was not changed by a speech. It was changed by a decision made in a plotting room, carried to a flight deck, and transformed into engine noise as aircraft rolled into the wind. The morning had begun with Japan holding the initiative. Nagumo's carriers had approached Midway expecting to crush the island, draw out the American fleet, and finish what Pearl Harbor had begun. By nightfall, the foundation of that plan lay in ruins. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were lost, their veteran air crews Deck crews, mechanics, and carrier specialists could not be easily replaced. The Imperial Japanese Navy still had powerful ships and skilled sailors, but its offensive reach had been permanently wounded. For the United States, Midway did not end the war. The road ahead would still pass through Guadalcanal, the Solomons, Tarawa, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. More ships would burn, more pilots would vanish into the sea, more families would receive telegrams that split their lives in two. But after Midway, the direction of the war had changed. The Japanese advance had been stopped. The American carrier force had survived. The balance of initiative began to shift across the Pacific. Slowly at first, then with growing force as new ships, new pilots, and new aircraft entered the struggle. And at the center of that turning point stood a commander who had not been expected to lead carriers in such a battle. A man without the theatrical fire of Halsey or the public image of a warrior admiral. Raymond A. Spruance had done something quieter and more difficult. He had judged the moment correctly. When the carriers were found, he did not wait for comfort. He did not demand perfect clarity. He did not allow fear of distance, fuel, or uncertainty to freeze the strike. He knew the enemy was vulnerable, and he knew that waiting could be fatal. So the order went out. Aircraft launched. Torpedo planes descended into sacrifice. Dive bombers found the opening. Japanese flight decks burned. Hiryu struck back and was destroyed. Night came, and Spruance preserved the victory by refusing to gamble it away. In the years after, historians would debate details, timings, personalities, and decisions. They would examine messages, flight paths, squadron choices, and command relationships. But the essential drama remained simple enough to see. An enemy fleet was hidden in the vast Pacific. A scout found it. A commander understood what the sighting meant, and when the moment came, Raymond A. Spruance gave the order that turned discovery into attack. Launch the attack,